Good morning and welcome to the Point. This past week on Thursday, Vice President Mike Pence spent most of his day in Macomb County here in the state. I had an opportunity to talk to him about a number of subjects. Here is just one of the questions I asked. I know that you're going to be talking a lot about reopening the economy and getting people back to work. How difficult is it to balance the health of the economy and the health of the American people at the same time?
From very early on in this pandemic, the president gave us one priority, and that was to save American lives. But after the people of Michigan and people all across this country made the sacrifices, engaged in social distancing, we wanted to give guidelines to states across the country to safely reopen, because it really isn't a choice between the health of the American people and the health of our economy. It's a choice between health and health. And there are real world consequences to people through the shutdowns that we've endured. And it's the reason why we're so grateful to see states across the country now, all 50 states, safely and responsibly reopening. We're being diligent to watch those states where we're seeing some increase in cases, but we're so encouraged by the fact that cases have largely stabilized across the country, and in many states are going down. Hospitalizations are dropping precipitously. Most importantly, our losses are dropping. That's a real testament to the sacrifices the American people have made. But as you could see here today at the Engine House, the American people are ready to get back to work. The jobs numbers we're seeing all across the country give evidence of the fact that after all the sacrifices we've made, we're ready to open up America again.
As I pointed out, the vice president's trip was very much about reopening the economy. But we did talk about other subjects, and I'll tell you where you can hear the rest of this interview at the end of this program. Traveling with the vice president for at least part of his tour was Republican candidate for U.S. Senate John James. Earlier in the week, we spoke to him about current events and his campaign. Let's talk about the process of running for office in a very different world than it was 2 years ago when you were running. I want to talk to you about the campaign, but first I want to talk to you about some of the very serious issues that are facing this country right now, and starting with what we've seen in the form of demonstrations about social injustice and systemic racism, and your response as a candidate seeking to be a member of the United States Senate. How does that impact you, and how do you think the government should be listening and responding?
Well, I think the best thing we can do as a people in the state of Michigan is to make sure that we have the best representation and the most experience forward as we emerge from the physical and economic struggles of COVID, and as we seek to repair hundreds of years of racial injustice, particularly focused on African Americans and how we move beyond this. I got to be honest with you. As a Black man, every single time I see people like George Floyd, I see a reflection of myself. As a Black man, I recognize that this isn't new. This has been happening for years. You don't have to go as far back as Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Beecher Stowe. You can go back in the 80s and 90s and listen to NAA and listen to Tupac Shakur. You can listen to Kendrick Lamar. You can listen to the artists and people who have been screaming out almost into the night about racial injustice for decades, and people who've been in position to fix this situation for 30 years in office in the government for decades, either haven't because they can't or because they won't. I believe that coming at this from somebody who understands what it feels like to sit on a street corner and wonder if his son is going to see him bleed out in the street because he got pulled over by a cop, that's something that is very, very important to be able to bring that personal lived experience. But also important is someone like me who's been an officer in a combat zone, who's had to make life and death decisions in a split second through the fog of war, somebody who understands what it's like to put my family on the back burner, to go out and put my life on the line to protect freedoms for people who may just as soon see me dead. That's a firsthand lived experience that I think we will need to bridge the gap between the police and the policed. I believe that being in the position to bring concrete solutions and deliver results now, not in 5 minutes, not in 5 seconds, but right now. There are people hurting, and we don't need more commissions and study groups. We need experience of people who understand from both sides and can bring the sides together to begin to heal this nation by addressing the root causes for these problems, which is desperation and lack of trust. I think that we can get to trust with increased training and increased transparency. And I'm looking forward to bringing my experience to bear both as an officer and as a Black man, somebody who's raising 3 Black boys. This is something that's a matter of life and death for us. It's not a political talking point.
You talk about your life experiences, and in those, how do you bring people together who come at this at very different viewpoints, people who have suffered from the injustices that you talk about that have been in our system, in our society for not just a few months, but decades, hundreds of years, and people who haven't experienced that and thereby perhaps don't grasp it with the same kind of severity that people who have experienced it.
Well, see, that's the thing. That's why representation is so important, Rick. That's why firsthand experience is so important, Rick. I was raised by 2 Democrats in the Jim Crow South. My father in particular watched his, had uncles who swung from trees and had relatives who came back and were lynched in their uniforms. He came back from Vietnam in a very, very different situation where Vietnam veterans were spit on. I understand this situation from a firsthand experience, and then being able to translate that for my wife, who is Caucasian, and we have 3 brown babies, and trying to get her to understand someone who was raised in Ada, Michigan, in a very different situation from me, who was raised in Detroit, Michigan. And when you talk about the ability to bring together different parties, I'm a walking example of what that looks like. I'm living it. This isn't something that shows up in a poll in an election year. This isn't something that I have to go through and have listening sessions, though we need to increase our listening. I don't know everything, but I think that coming at this from personal lived experience is how you bridge that gap. I have the trust when I talk to African Americans, though they may not like the R by my name, I can't outrun my skin color. I'm still a Black man in America. And I recognize that the Republican Party was founded as the party of emancipation that freed the slaves and held this nation together. And that's the same Republican Party that needs to step up and recognize that all men, regardless of race, color, and creed, are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights that are among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have shirked from our responsibility to stand up and make sure that no man is in bondage, regardless of what your skin color looks like. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to speak to people who are desperate, regardless of where their situation are, because people, regardless of race right now, but particularly and disproportionately African American, people are talking about the wrong problem. We're trying to police people better in poverty rather than bringing them out of their situation. I'm sick of it, Rick. I'm sick of it. Because these problems aren't getting fixed. And now all of a sudden it's important in an election year, that my life is important to you in an election year, when my life hasn't been important to you for the past 38 years of my life. We've been talking about this for 400 years. That's not good enough. We need solutions right now. And I'm not interested in your political talking points. I want somebody on the front who looks like me, who represents me, who has my values. And if I don't look like you, I know that whether you're colored or conservative, you will not be silenced. You will not be marginalized. And we will have representation, whether you're Democrat or Republican, whether you're male or female, and whether you're Black or white in the U.S. Senate, because that's what's best for Michigan.
I hope we can continue this conversation as this campaign goes along, but I do want to move ahead to another major issue that the world has been suffering. Certainly we have in the United States, and that's COVID-19. You mentioned it early on as we start to emerge from this, and there are all of these issues to deal with. One of the things that your campaign put out this week is that you're going to start going to some of those areas that have been hardest hit, economically particularly, as well as with cases. But you say it points out something else that's also been around for a long time, and that's kind of systemic poverty and underemployment. Tell me what that looks like.
So I launched the campaign last year on June 6th, and I have an anti-poverty initiative, a prosperity agenda, and one part of it was our nickel promise, giving just a nickel for every dollar that we raise to help clothe the naked, to help feed the hungry, to help heal the sick, and take care of our veterans. I believe that when you've been blessed, we have an obligation to be a blessing to others, and as a result of that promise, we've been able to give over 500,000 to people around the state who truly need it. I was kind of appalled by the amount of resources that we would need to raise, and understanding that money would go to television stations and not to the people who desperately were in need. We wanted to address poverty in urban areas by taking action right now. And we were able to do that. The second half is our path to prosperity, where we're taking a look at the disinvestment and the marginalization of folks in urban and rural environments. One of the things I learned last time is that we are remarkably similar as Americans, Black or white, gay or straight, male, female, and whether you're on a forgotten farm or a neglected neighborhood, whether Democrats can reliably count on your vote, or they don't come to your town because you don't have enough votes. These are the areas that are suffering the most. Namely, you look at the state of Michigan has the second highest unemployment, higher than recession levels, Great Recession levels. 17 of the highest unemployment counties are around the country are in Michigan. And we all know that Detroit has been hit hard by unemployment, 33% poverty rate, but very, very few people know that Sheboygan has a higher than 40% unemployment rate right now. Urban poverty and rural poverty have the same negative impacts regardless of your race. Has a disproportionate negative effect, and people aren't being served by our current senators and our current elected officials, and that's wrong. So rather than focusing on anything that's a distraction, we're going to focus on the people who are most desperate need and people who need results and solutions now. We're going to focus on things that unite us, on increasing and making our education system better, repatriating economic opportunity, fixing education for adults and children, improving our infrastructure to include our roads, our water, our infrastructure, and transit. There's so much more. And if you want to learn more about it, go to johnjamesforsenate.com. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter at John James MI.
Because we had so much content this week, there's more of that interview as well. And again, at the end of the show, I'll tell you how you can access that. When we come back, U.S. Senator Gary Peters talks about current events and his campaign. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. This week, in an effort to get back to covering campaigns and politics, I spoke with both U.S. Senator Gary Peters and Republican challenger John James. But we also had the vice president in the state, so there's a lot of content that we couldn't get in the show this morning. We will have more about that in just a few minutes. But now, my conversation with Senator Gary Peters. Senator, I want to talk to you about some of the current events. You and I have discussed some of this in the past. You were with us for a recent town hall. But one of the things we haven't talked too much about is that this is an election season. And so all of this kind of factors into that. But I want to start with some of the critical, really important issues that have been raised through protest and people really expressing their outrage about social injustice and about systemic racism. You've heard the folks from your state talk about this. What is it that can be done from a federal level? I appreciate the conversation has to happen everywhere. But from your perspective, how do we move forward to try to address some of the issues that have been raised and to make sure people know that their voices are being heard, which seems right now to be one of the most important things?
There's no question about it, and we have to address these issues, and we got to stop talking about it. It's really about taking action, and that action is critically important. And as you mentioned in the question, this is something that has to be done at the federal level, the state level, the local level. We all have to come together. And it's also not just about legislation, as important as that is, and I'll mention some areas there, but it's really about changing the hearts and minds of people. That when we wake up in the morning and look at ourselves in the mirror, we have to appreciate that when we go out into the world, we have to treat everybody, no matter who they are, no matter where they live, with respect and with dignity. And that's where we have to go as a world. But we know that is not happening now. We still have systemic injustice in our system, particularly in the criminal justice system. We need to take some action. Hopefully we will do that quickly. I'm pressing the Republican leader in the Senate to bring this up as quickly as possible so that we can address what we're hearing and protest across Michigan as well as across the country. There are a number of pieces of legislation that I think are important for us to pass and to do that now. One of those pieces is to make sure we have independent investigations. It's something I've been hearing over and over again, is if a police officer engages in behavior that and is accused of wrongdoing, there should be an independent investigation. It shouldn't happen within the department. And oftentimes that looks as if the department may be taking care of their own, or a prosecutor, the local prosecutor as well. There needs to be an independent agency to do that, to review it in that way. We also have to ban some practices like chokeholds. That has no place in law enforcement now. We can do that at the federal level. But I also think, and there are many, I could go on a long list, but I've actually introduced this week another piece of legislation that is critically important, and that's to get back to the roots of community policing, to make sure that our police officers are in the community, getting to know the individuals, know them by name, know the ins and out, and even more importantly, the residents get to know those police officers. We know when community policing is used around the country, it is very effective. We've got to do more of that. And I think that also means we've got to hire folks from the community. And I've just introduced legislation this week, the support of the NAACP, the Urban League, as well as police organizations. It's bipartisan, which is the way I like to work. I'm working with a Republican senator from Texas. And what it'll do is it'll provide resources to individuals who want to go into law enforcement to help pay for the police academy and for their training. And if they work in the same community that they grew up in or live in, they will have that as a grant, and they will not have to pay for that training. And they have to agree to work for at least 4 years in that department, in their community. They come from the community. And it's certainly my expectation, if you're there for 4 years, you're likely to spend a long time there and build a career in the community that you were raised in, and one that you understand intimately.
It's interesting that you talk about a theme that I've heard for so many people, and that is about having officers from the community that are reflective of the racial makeup and the socioeconomic and all of the other things. How hard is that to get people to go into police work, given the inherent dangers and frankly, the conversation surrounding law enforcement right now?
Well, I think that's what we have to put in perspective too. And I will say, we all know the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, nearly, most all police officers go to work every day. They do it with professionalism, they do it with courage, and they put themselves at risk when they're out there. So we need to recruit good people. We need to show that this is a great career for them to get into. And we have to make good hiring decisions, because this is not a career for some other people. And we need to make sure that those folks are not part of it. And if they stray from what is acceptable and what is legal, then they need to be held accountable for that. But having said that, recruiting is an issue. I hear that as I go all across the state of Michigan. Police forces are having a difficult time recruiting people that want to go into law enforcement. It is hard work. You have to work long hours on weekends. You have people that are angry at you, and sometimes you have people that shoot at you. And so it is not a career that everybody wants to seek. And that's why we should think about how do we incentivize, how to recruit quality individuals to come forward and become law enforcement officers that we can trust in our community.
And just a point of clarity from something else you mentioned a moment ago, you talked about having an independent review board. I assume you're talking about that on a local level. That would not be a federal review board.
No, that wouldn't be. And part of the federal legislation is to incentivize some of that, create some grants to facilitate that. So, for example, in Grand Rapids, if there is an issue here, the Grand Rapids Department actually reaches out to the state police. There's an example, but that's not, you don't see that around the state or around the country. But that's where you bring in a fresh set of eyes, because ultimately, what these incidents do is they break down the trust in the community, and we know a community can't function without trust. You have to have that trust, and when you lose trust, it's very tough to regain it. And so having an independent investigation with fresh eyes will hopefully allow community members to see that incident, whatever it is, through the lens of an independent review and trust that review. It certainly will help the process. And ultimately, we have to make sure justice is served. It's all about accountability, and we have to do it in a way that people trust.
In what may be an understatement, 2020 has been a very trying year, and we are dealing with the issues that you and I are just discussing, but that's right on the heels of a worldwide pandemic that has hit Michigan hard. The good news is that our numbers have subsided. We're beginning to open back up. Conversations are being had about what school might look like this fall. Still, there's a question about what more the federal government may be doing in that role. Again, you and I have discussed this, but thinking about it in terms of more like a reality now, because even though we're just in the early summer, those school preparations have to be made. Those budgets will go into effect on July 1. And here in the state of Michigan, and I would guess a lot of other states, they're wondering if there's going to be any more federal money to A, help schools backfill what they may need, help other state budget line items, and people want to know, is there going to be another stimulus direct payment to many people who got one earlier in the year, but still could be hurting?
Well, I think the important way to look at that is that we know the virus is still out there. Certainly the numbers are better, and we have to continue to do our own individual duty when it comes to making sure we maintain social distancing, wear a mask whenever possible to do the spread. But it's still out there, and we need to be prepared to deal with this for some time. It may be until we get a virus that we can really say, or excuse me, we get a vaccine to the virus, that we can actually be able to move on. I'm ranking member on the Senate Homeland Security Committee. I'm the top Democrat. So I oversee FEMA. And as you know, FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management folks overseeing the whole response. So I've been intimately involved in this, making sure we have personal protection equipment for our healthcare providers. And now that we're opening up the economy, everybody needs to have access to that kind of protection equipment. We also have to do a whole lot more in testing. We still have to make sure we can broadly test so we can identify who is sick and who's not. And when we find someone who's sick, do the kind of basic public health contact tracing to try to contain it. So we have to do all of that. But as we continue to do that, to your point, we know schools and local governments have been impacted in a dramatic way. We have huge numbers of unemployment across the country, unprecedented in recent times. And we hope to get those people back to work as quickly as possible. But if we get another flare-up of the COVID in the fall, we need to be prepared for that as well. So we have to make sure we have stockpiles of those equipment. But when it comes to budgets, when it comes to school budgets and state and local, as you know, the state has to have a balanced budget. They can't go into a deficit. And yet their revenues have dropped dramatically. You're seeing that in our local communities and in schools. We will have to provide federal help. In my mind, we need to provide that help. Right now, I don't like going into deficits and increasing that debt, but we are in a crisis. And if you're going to borrow money now, the interest rates are really, really low. This is the time to make sure that we don't let the economy continue to go down and have a tailspin downward. So we make the kinds of investments to shore up the economy, protect our small businesses. I'm focused on making sure our small businesses survive. We can't even imagine an economy recovering as quick as any of us would like, or as safely as any of us would like, if we lose our small businesses. They're the engine of growth. We need to make sure that they continue to have the resources. And in reopening their additional cost, how do we help them reopen and start bringing back their employees and grow? So I'm hoping we will do that quickly as well. The House has already passed a package. It's now over into the Senate. Republican leader McConnell said he will look at this perhaps in July. But we certainly need to do it as quickly as possible and make sure that we're helping not only local communities and families and small businesses, but also making sure our health providers have the resources they need. Because first and foremost, this is a public health crisis. It's a crisis on many fronts, but first and foremost, public health.
So despite everything else that's going on in the world, there is an election coming up, and I asked each of my guests this morning about their respective campaigns. However, we didn't have time to put them in this show. When I come back in just a moment, I'll tell you where you can hear the rest of the interviews. To the point. We want to thank Senator Peters, candidate John James, and of course the Vice President for talking with us this week. As I told you during the show, we didn't have time to put all of those interviews in this program. If you go to woodtv.com and look for a To the Point Extra, you'll get the rest of our conversations. I hope you'll join us next Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.